New Jersey, a state known for its crowded highways, roaring stadiums, and cities that rarely sleep. But far from the noise of downtown, there are small neighborhoods where the nights are almost too quiet. One of those places was a modest suburb outside Newark. A row of small houses stood beneath tall maple trees. Streetlights flickered softly, illuminating empty sidewalks. In one of those houses lived a 23-year-old man named Daniel Carter. Daniel wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He was just another young man trying to survive in a city that never stopped moving. His life was simple, almost boring. And maybe that was exactly why no one expected what would happen to him. Daniel grew up in that same house his entire life. His father, Michael Carter, used to work as a mechanic. His hands were always covered in grease, but he was known as the kindest man in the neighborhood. His mother, Sarah Carter, worked night shifts at a hospital. Money was always tight in their home, but Daniel never complained. He understood something very early in life. Sometimes survival itself is a full-time job. After finishing community college, Daniel tried several jobs: warehouse worker, delivery driver, gas station cashier, but none of them lasted long. Finally, he accepted a job that no one else wanted, a night cleaning job at one of the biggest stadiums in the state, the massive MetLife Stadium. Most people only saw the stadium during games, crowds screaming, music blasting, lights everywhere. But Daniel only saw it when it was empty, completely empty. His shift started at 1 a.m., long after the fans had gone home, long after the lights were shut down. The first time he walked inside the stadium at night, he felt something strange. The place felt too big, too silent. Every footstep echoed like a whisper in a cathedral. Thousands of empty seats stared down at him in darkness. And that's when his supervisor told him something strange. Not a warning. Not exactly. More like rules. Daniel's supervisor was an older man named Frank Holden. Frank had worked at the stadium for nearly 20 years. He rarely smiled, and when Daniel first met him, Frank looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Then he handed Daniel a small laminated card. On it were 5 simple rules. Frank spoke slowly, almost like he had said these words 1,000 times before. "Kid, if you're going to work nights here, you follow these rules exactly." Daniel chuckled. "Rules? For cleaning?" Frank didn't laugh, not even a little. Instead, he pointed toward the dark stadium seating. "After 3 a.m., don't go to section 128. Daniel frowned. "Why?" Frank ignored the question. He continued. "Rule 2. If the stadium screens turn on by themselves, leave the building immediately." Daniel blinked. Now that sounded ridiculous, but Frank's face remained serious. And then he said the rule that Daniel never forgot. Rule 3. If you hear something running in the seats, don't look up.
Daniel assumed it was just a joke, some weird tradition for new workers. His first few nights were quiet. He cleaned empty hallways, wiped down railings, mopped concrete floors. Nothing strange happened. Until the night when the game ran late. The stadium didn't empty until nearly midnight, which meant Daniel started working much later than usual. By the time he reached the upper seating sections, the stadium clock read 3:06 a.m. And that's when he heard it. Footsteps. Running. Somewhere high in the empty seats. Fast. Heavy. Like something was sprinting across the rows. Daniel slowly lifted his head, and then he suddenly remembered. Frank's rule. Don't look up. Daniel froze. The sound was unmistakable. Heavy footsteps rushing across the stadium seats. Not one step, not two. Dozens, like something large was sprinting across the empty rows. The stadium was supposed to be completely empty. No fans, no workers, no security patrol in this section. Daniel tightened his grip on the mop handle. The footsteps suddenly stopped. Complete silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. He slowly exhaled. "Probably a raccoon," he whispered to himself. But deep inside, he knew raccoons didn't run like that. And raccoons didn't sound that heavy. Daniel remembered Frank's words again. "If you hear something running in the seats, don't look up." He forced himself to stare at the floor and slowly continued mopping. Daniel tried to ignore it. He finished cleaning the aisle and began pushing the cart toward the corridor. That's when something strange happened. Click. A loud electronic sound echoed through the stadium. Daniel turned. One of the giant stadium screens flickered, then another, and another. Within seconds, 3 massive screens lit up across the stadium. But there was no game, no broadcast, just security camera footage. Daniel squinted. The cameras were showing different sections of the stadium. Section 101, Section 112, Section 128. And that's when his stomach dropped. Because on the screen showing Section 128, something moved. Not a person, not exactly. Something tall and thin, standing between the seats, watching the camera. Daniel stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure on the screen didn't move like a human. It bent sideways, slowly. Its arms looked too long, too thin, like branches stretching from a tree. And then something even worse happened. The camera feed suddenly switched. Now the screen showed another section, Section 134, empty. Then it switched again, Section 140, empty. Then again and again. Each time the cameras moved closer to where Daniel was standing. Daniel suddenly realized something terrifying. The cameras weren't showing random places. They were tracking something. Something moving through the stadium. The stadium speakers suddenly crackled. Daniel jumped. A faint whisper echoed across the empty arena. At first, it sounded like static. Then it slowly formed into words. A voice. Soft, distorted, almost playful. "You looked up." Daniel's blood ran cold. Because he hadn't. He had followed the rule. He never looked up. But the voice repeated again, slower this time. "You looked up." Daniel backed away from the cleaning cart. The giant screens flickered again, and suddenly every camera feed showed the same thing, the same section, the same place, the exact row where Daniel was standing. But there was one difference. In the camera feed, Daniel wasn't alone. Daniel slowly turned his head, not upward, just slightly, just enough to glance behind him. And that's when he saw it. 2 rows above him, Something was crouched between the seats. Its body was thin and pale, its fingers stretched across the backs of the chairs, and its head tilted sideways like a curious animal. But the worst part was its smile, a wide grin that stretched far wider than any human face should. And it spoke again, this time not through the speakers, but right behind him. You weren't supposed to notice. Daniel didn't scream. He couldn't. His body felt locked in place, like every muscle had suddenly forgotten how to move. The creature crouched 2 rows above him, its long fingers wrapped around the backs of the plastic seats. The stadium lights were dim, but Daniel could still see its pale skin, almost gray, almost lifeless. And those eyes, they weren't glowing, they weren't red, they were just empty, like deep holes where something should have been. The creature tilted its head further, watching Daniel like a scientist studying an experiment. And then it slowly climbed down 1 row. Closer. Daniel's breathing became shallow. He remembered something Frank had said during training, something Daniel had ignored at the time. Most people who break the rules don't last long here. At the time, Daniel thought it was a joke, but now, standing in that silent stadium, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. The creature stopped moving, just 1 row above him now. Daniel could hear something strange, a faint clicking sound, like bones shifting inside its body. The creature leaned forward, its long arms stretching toward him. But then, boom! A loud metal door slammed somewhere deep inside the stadium. The creature instantly snapped its head toward the sound and vanished. Gone, like it had never been there. Footsteps echoed through the corridor, fast, heavy, someone running. Daniel turned toward the tunnel entrance. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and then he heard a familiar voice. Frank. "Kid, don't move!" Frank rushed into the seating area, breathing heavily. He looked around quickly, scanning every row. Then he grabbed Daniel by the arm. "Did you look up?" Daniel hesitated. Frank's face turned pale, because that hesitation was all the answer he needed. Frank slowly closed his eyes and muttered something under his breath. Damn it. Frank pulled Daniel toward the tunnel, fast, almost dragging him. Daniel stumbled behind him. "Frank, what was that thing?" Frank didn't answer at first. They stopped near the maintenance corridor. Frank looked back toward the dark stadium like he was expecting something to follow them. Then he finally spoke, quietly, like someone might hear him. "That stadium wasn't built on empty land." Daniel frowned. Frank continued. "Back in the 1800s, this place was forest. People disappeared here. Hunters, travelers, workers building the first roads. Some said something lived in those woods, something that hunted at night. And when the stadium was built, they didn't remove it. They trapped it. Under the seats. Under section 128. Daniel's mind raced. "That thing lives here?" Frank shook his head slowly. "Not exactly." He pointed toward the stadium seating again. "It moves. Every night. Through the tunnels, through the seats, through the dark parts nobody checks." Daniel swallowed. "Then why keep the stadium open?" Frank gave a bitter smile. "Because it only hunts when someone breaks the rules." Daniel felt cold. Frank leaned closer and whispered something Daniel would never forget. And tonight, it noticed you. At that exact moment, the stadium lights suddenly went out. Every single one. Darkness swallowed the arena, and somewhere above them, Daniel heard it again. Running. The stadium lights were gone. Complete darkness swallowed the arena. Only Frank's small flashlight remained, shaking slightly in his hand. Daniel held his breath. Then it started again. Thud, thud, thud. Something was running across the seats above them, fast, much faster than before. Frank's face tightened. He whispered urgently, "Don't move." The footsteps rushed across multiple rows, then suddenly stopped, directly above their tunnel entrance. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a long, thin arm slowly appeared over the railing above them. The fingers were impossibly long, and they began tapping on the metal rail. Tap, tap, tap. Like something was thinking. Frank grabbed Daniel's sleeve. "Come with me." They hurried down a narrow maintenance corridor beneath the seating area. The hallway smelled old, dusty, like a place nobody visited anymore. Daniel noticed something strange. The walls had markings, old ones, scratches, deep claw marks in the concrete. Daniel slowed. "Frank, what is this place?" Frank didn't stop walking. "This stadium has older tunnels under it." "Maintenance areas that were sealed decades ago?" Daniel looked behind them. The tunnel felt colder the deeper they went. Then Frank stopped in front of a large metal door. Rust covered most of it, and painted across the door were 3 faded words. Section 128. Access. Frank whispered, "Here's where they sealed it." Daniel stared at the door. "You said they trapped it here." Frank nodded slowly. "Years ago, before I worked here, something happened." He rubbed his face nervously. "One night shift crew never went home." Daniel felt a chill. Security cameras showed them running. Running from something. Frank pointed toward the sealed door. "They came from inside there." Daniel swallowed. "What happened to them?" Frank looked away. "They were found the next morning, scattered across the seats." Daniel's stomach twisted. Frank whispered quietly, "But the weirdest part? None of them had any injuries." Daniel frowned. "Then how did they die?" Frank looked directly at him. They all had the same expression. Fear. Pure, frozen fear. Abbas. Suddenly, a loud metallic sound echoed through the tunnel. Clang! Both men froze. The rusted door in front of them moved, just slightly. Frank's flashlight beam shook. That door hasn't opened in 30 years. The metal slowly creaked. Creak. A narrow crack appeared. Cold air poured from inside. Daniel felt goosebumps across his arms. Something inside the darkness moved. Then a voice came from the tunnel behind them. Soft, playful, exactly like before. "You brought another one." Daniel slowly turned around. At the far end of the corridor, the creature stood upright, much taller than before. Its long arms nearly touched the floor, and its smile, was even wider now. Frank whispered something Daniel almost didn't hear. "Don't run." But Daniel's instincts screamed otherwise. The creature took a slow step forward. Its bones cracked loudly as it moved, like its body wasn't meant to stand upright. Then it spoke again, not loud, not threatening, almost curious. "New faces, every few years." Daniel realized something horrifying. This wasn't an accident. This thing had been here for decades, maybe longer, watching, waiting. And the rules Frank gave him weren't meant to protect workers. They were meant to keep the creature asleep. And tonight, Daniel had woken it up. The creature stepped forward. Its joints cracked loudly, echoing through the narrow tunnel. Frank's grip tightened on Daniel's arm. He whispered one word. "Run." Both of them turned and sprinted down the corridor. Behind them, something slammed into the concrete floor. Fast footsteps followed. Not human footsteps. Something heavier. Something faster. Daniel's lungs burned as they ran through the maintenance tunnels. Frank shouted ahead, "Stairs! Hurry!" They burst through a metal door and climbed the narrow stairwell 2 steps at a time, but the sound behind them kept getting closer. 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 They burst out onto the empty stadium field. Cold night air hit Daniel's face. The massive arena surrounded them in darkness. For a moment, everything was silent again. Frank bent forward, catching his breath. Daniel turned. "Did we lose it?" Frank slowly shook his head. "No." And then they heard it, running again, but this time, not in the tunnels. Above them. The creature sprinted across the stadium seats, moving row to row with terrifying speed, like a predator circling its prey. Frank suddenly grabbed Daniel's shoulder. His expression had changed. He looked calm now. Too calm. "Listen to me carefully," Frank said. Daniel stared at him. "You need to leave this stadium." Daniel shook his head. "What about you?" Frank forced a small smile. "Someone has to keep it busy." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Frank, no." But Frank had already grabbed a metal pipe from the ground. Then he shouted loudly toward the stadium seats. "Hey!" The creature stopped running. Its head slowly turned toward Frank. Frank whispered to Daniel. "Go." Daniel ran. Across the field, toward the stadium exit tunnel. Behind him, he heard Frank shouting again, trying to lure the creature away. Then, a terrible scream echoed through the stadium. Daniel stopped. For a moment, he almost turned back. But then he remembered Frank's final words. "Leave the stadium." Daniel ran faster. He burst through the exit gate and didn't stop until he reached the empty parking lot. Behind him, the stadium stood silent again, like nothing had ever happened. The next morning, police searched the stadium. Frank Holden was never found, not a single trace. Security cameras showed Daniel running out of the building at 3:27 a.m., but something else appeared on the footage, just for a moment. Behind Daniel, at the top of the stadium seats, a tall figure watching him leave. Daniel never returned to the stadium. He moved out of Newark a few weeks later. But the stadium never closed. Games continued. Fans kept cheering. And every night, after midnight, a new cleaning crew still arrives at MetLife Stadium. Each new worker receives the same laminated card, the same rules. And somewhere, deep in the empty seats, something still runs in the dark, waiting for someone to look up.